Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next session with Dr. Barbara Simoes, who is currently a visiting professor at the University of Toronto. And she specialises in Afro-Brazilian studies, post-colonial and decolonial studies, and offers a comparative global perspective on slavery, trauma, and memory throughout her huge body of work. She was previously an associate professor at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Brazil, and she's widely published on slavery, decoloniality, memory. Her monograph of 2022, African Diaspora, Ghosts of Slavery, Traumatic Memories in Novels of Brazil, Angola, and the USA, makes global connections, analysing colonialism, slavery, diaspora, and alterity in these novels, and the effects of slavery in these countries. Beyond this, Dr. Simoes is interested in connecting her work to thinking about a Latino Canadian diaspora. Welcome. We're very
Thank
glad
you.
to have you here. And your work in many ways extends what this conference is trying to address, which is the global diaspora, multilingual, multinational culture that Equiano's world inhabited. Could I ask you, as a Latin American scholar, please tell us a little bit more about your approach to Latin American decolonial studies, especially considering the work of Quijano, Mignolo, and the coloniality of power as an epistemic condition.
Yes. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. And so just trying to link that to what I've been doing. So rescuing some of what Mignolo and Quijano say, which interests me here. So basically, coloniality is what makes modernity possible for Mignolo and Quijano. So the main pillar of the argument is racism and the assumption that white Europeans were superior to non-white groups from other parts of the world. As this is also in Fanon, and then you have race as a main like idea that formats world colonial capitalism and organizes modern relations of colonization. So in this sense, modernity is this like monster with three heads and but just exhibiting one head, which is modernity. But the other two heads are hidden, decoloniality and coloniality, but they are part of the monster. And of course, they are going to be hidden because all the poverty, oppression, and subjugation of the knowledges is contained into these two heads. So I study authors like Harriet Jacobs, so 19th century authors, Harriet Jacobs in the States, Marianne Shad, a Black Canadian author, and Maria Firmina dos Reis, African Brazilian author. I think that to some degree, they try to negotiate the survival of Black identities in countries that were established by colonial projects and that suffocated other non-white forms of knowledge and existence. So but these forms they go on, they persist across the 20th century, and it's very clear when we look, for example, to the works of Toni Morrison and a book like Paradise that I think is really addressing, the limits of Black nationalism and assimilation and the paradox between all these things and the impossibilities of a paradise to be implemented because it cannot be implemented um, on based on modernity because modernity is part of the monster. So I think that there is a disillusionment, this idea that is in Morrison is already or had been already hinted in Shad or Jacobs and Firmina in the 19th century because they show the inconsistencies of the project. So Quijano and Mignolo, they state that coloniality and modernity are the opposite sides of the same coin. So it's inevitable. One emerges as the only way to keep the other one in place. So modernity presents itself as salvation, progress, and civilization, but hides the obscure side of capitalist modern world system called coloniality. And then that's responsible for the eradication of native knowledges based in non-European languages and praxis around of living around the world, including African peoples transplanted to the Americas. So in this sense that I link the decolonial process, right? This idea, the colonial process, it comes from what Mignolo calls decolonial turn, and to assess and to displace knowledge, power, religion, language, and allow other forms of being in the world and to be recognized as legitimate. So I think in Paradise, for example, Morrison is addressing the contradiction in the title, as I said before, against the very plot of the book. And in the whole thing of the book of these people carrying, the pieces of the bricks that make the oven. Uh, there is an oven that is carried across the states of the United States to go to be carried to this place where they're going to establish a community that is supposed to be a paradise, but ends up being super racist because they can't escape the thing that they are. That everything that they believe is stated on modernity, and this project that this is the paradox. It's in the beginning of everything. So that's why I think that African diaspora authors, they have to be read in a continental frame because they are all struggling with the same thing, which is this paradox of modernity that Miolo and Quijano work with. So just summarizing it a little bit and trying to link to African diasporic writers that I work with, and trying to link with this decolonial approach, and that I research on.
Thank you so much. And as you're talking, I'm thinking of so many of the things that you referenced that Guiano himself uh, deals with in his book. Certainly this, he is captured by the forces of modernity. And so while he's showing the technologies of the Middle Passage and the technologies of plantation and knowledge that are all very has been de-indigenized, he's been captured, and others, he's showing both sides that you talk about at the same time. So I'm thinking of that, and as you say, how Jacobs does it, Toni Morrison does it, and so in many ways your framing asks us to think of a global south framing for a lot of literature that actually here in the global north, I'm speaking from Canada, but also in the United States, doesn't always take into consideration theorists like Quijano or Fanon, who are often relegated to sort of separate fields of study. And so a lot of what you're saying is asking us to have this wider frame of knowledge that understands the dispossession from the global south as our theoretical understanding. So that's so interesting. I want to move on to ask you about what you're gesturing to there too, which is the idea of considering Latino Canadian studies also now as part of the transnational Canadian ethnicities or identities. I have just come from teaching. I was living in San Antonio for 5 years. I was teaching at the borderlands. So somewhere like that, the idea of Latinx identity, Chicana identity is very, very clear, very visible. It's in curricula, but up here in Canada, that's not so much the case. So maybe you could talk to that.
Yeah, so this is something I noticed as soon as I got here. You have a complete absence of Latinx studies or Latino Canadian studies in universities, and of course there is a difference because the Latino, sorry, community and the state is much bigger, right? So there is this difference, but still we exist here. So and we are writing, and we are writing poetry and literature for some decades now. So you have two things, which is the Latinx studies, which and Latino Canadian literature. So studies, which would be just comparing here African American literature and Black Canadian literature. So these are even two different things, but you don't have them, right? Really in the programs and departments, and I'm really concerned. I'm really trying to think, how to contribute in this sense, and thinking of an anthology. So there is one critical anthology which was written in 2000, published in 2007. So that's the existing thing that we have. It's called the Latino Canada. So it talks about 10 authors, but as I said, it was published in 2007. And after that, so almost 20 years, many things happened and many waves of migration that changed the demographic a little bit. So at first, you have like lots of people from, especially from Chile, but from other countries too. But Chile was the main immigration. But most of the immigrants that come, at the end of the 20th century, 60s and 70s, they come because of political persecution. So they are, being exiled of their countries. But now we still have that. We still have some dictatorships in certain areas, but the majority of the migration is because of an economic reason. So we call this economic exiles. So it's a different type of exile. It's an economic one. So people searching for better opportunities in life. And also, these authors of contemporary times of the past 2 decades, they're not writing so much about the dictatorship and their trauma of the dictator, ship in their countries and escaping, but they are writing about other things. And I think most of the writing is very complex when it addresses this state of yourself, this condition of being somebody who is, in a place that is not your home, but it's your home. And so you have, like a mirada estrábica almost, which I'm taking from Ricardo Piglia, like a concept just to adapt to this one, because I think it also adapts into this. So you have two ways of looking to yourself and to your reality, and developing a language in between, okay, the two places also. So talking about Spanish or Portuguese and English. So you are also writing in English, but including your Spanish or Portuguese rhythm in that English. So I think that's pretty interesting. We have, so many authors now, and I really think that there is a need of a new anthology and of more research in that field, and I'm very interested in that, and I've been trying to work on that a little bit. Yes.
Thank you so much. Yes, and that's so, I mean, I think again that moving between worlds is something Equiano in the Black Atlantic, and having the language loss and having, the culture that you're adapting to doesn't know the culture that you've come out of. And I think that's so pertinent to many Canadian non-white lives at the moment. I wonder if I can ask you to think about your book on trauma and memory, and to think about it in terms of Brazil. Equiano moves quite far down the Caribbean, but he doesn't get, and he goes down to the Mosquito Coast, but he doesn't get as far down as Brazil. But in fact, the worlds that he's gesturing to are telling the reader, like there's the whole of Turtle Island is affected by this system that I'm telling you about. And I know you talk about trauma and Toni Morrison's concept of rememory in Beloved, where there's sort of a living presence, a tangible, physical, living effect of trauma and events. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how you think through Morrison and slavery in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so in this recent book, I invest, and that's how I investigate. I comparatively, and it is three authors. The one author is Toni Morrison. The other author that I investigated with Toni Morrison is called Cornélio Pena. So he's a Brazilian author, and he has a book written in 1954 called The Dead Girl, A Menina Morta. And I investigated a third book with Beloved by Toni Morrison, this one. And the third book is by a writer from Angola called the Old House of the Banks. But talking more specifically about Toni Morrison in Brazil, that's your question here, which is part of my book there. I think there are differences. There are significant differences, even in the way we understood racism in Brazil and here in North America, and especially in the United States, and the way that the whole thing of emancipation happened in both countries. So we're gonna discuss history and everything. But these two books that I chose to investigate, and they almost are a perfect match, because one, even the title, one is called Dead Girl and the other one is Beloved. And when you read the book, and you know about what it is about, you immediately you think about the dead girl. But the dead girl is a white girl in Cornelio Pena's book. She is the a white girl of the White House, of the Great House. And what is in this book? These are two books written in the 20th century addressing problems or going back to the 19th century, trying to renegotiate this traumatic memory in the present. So Toni Morrison's trying is obviously doing that in the 80s and everything else, because this country that is now established on the idea of modernity that has to go west and be developed, but there are certain things that were left, you know, and these things they keep haunting this, developed nation in the present times. Now in Brazil, when this person, this author, wrote that book, and that's the 50s, and that's exactly the time of modernity in Brazil, the time when they were constructing our capital, Brasilia, in the center of Brazil, and everything in the country was like, we want to be a modern country, we want to be a modern nation, we don't want to be, an old nation, whatever. So all the even all the poets, they are trying to do the modern poetry, what we call poesia concreta, which is the modern progress thing. And this author is going back. He's going to the 19th century, to a time everybody wants to forget. Even all our slave cabins, they are demolished during these years. Most of them in farms, like in the southeast of Brazil. You can still find some, but it's difficult. Just some that were preserved, but most of the slave cabins, they were demolished because they did not want to see, they did not want to remember, and nobody wants to remember. And that's what Toni Morrison calls national amnesia. But sometimes you have to remember those things, you know, because you have to remember to make a movement and to go, and to go after that. Because you're certain, in a certain way you are stuck in those traumas, because you have to remember, but it's not to remember to be crying about it, but to produce something with that, and so that it does not happen again, right? So I think in this sense, I can also think of Equiano here and talking about the event. The whole thing of slave narrative is to remember again, to think about it, and to put it and to write about it, to make this register of that, so that, because it's haunting your mind and you have to put it out somehow. So I think new slave narratives also, they kind of go back to that same frame, although they are new slave narratives. But so I think it's the same, it's a similar theme that goes across all these narratives.
Yes, well, that's so fascinating. And what I'm struck by as you're talking is just the range that diasporic intellectuals have, from Brazil up to Canada, across to Angola. And again, that's exactly what Equiano's geographies are. I'll just end with this question because I know you are a published novelist, with 3 novels published in Brazil. Could you tell us a little bit about how these novels relate to the research you've been telling us about?
Yes. So it's they are totally related, because the first novel is about Maria Firmina dos Reis. Uh, I quoted her here in some one of the questions, in one of the questions. She is our first African Afro-Brazilian woman to publish a novel in Brazil. She published her novel in 1859. So I researched on her life, and this is a historical novel. And the third novel is that I just released in Brazil is about she an enslaved woman that was captured in Africa and taken to Brazil in the 18th century, and taken to the work in the mines, because that's when we have our gold rush in Brazil in 18th century. And she becomes a nun and a religious person, and she ends up being condemned by the Inquisition in Portugal. So she ends up in Portugal, and she dies there. So she's a very interesting character of our history. And both characters, they were absolutely unknown from from Brazilians. And like Maria Firmina dos Reis now is a little bit better known. Scholars have worked hard, in the past 10 years. But Rosa Egipciaca, which is who's the second character I'm talking about, this woman who lived in the 18th century, she's absolutely unknown. So I think this is I of course you write a novel about a story that you want to tell, but also it's also almost this mission to dig into these stories that are like really were made invisible in Brazil, in a country that did not want to look into the mirror. So I think that's how my my creative writing is connected to what I do as a scholar. Yes.
I often think what other things Equiano could have written if if his life, because that boundary between fact and fiction is so malleable the whole way through. And as you say, this is where fiction and neo-slave narratives help us to remember the past. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been incredibly rich. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so